Well, it's not clear yet if the charges against the former president would bar him from holding office. The situation is unprecedented, as we have been saying. But constituents don't seem to mind. An overwhelming 80% of GOP voters in one survey saying that Trump should still be eligible for the presidency, even if convicted. That's according to a CBS News YouGov poll. Joining us now, Steve Clemons, Semafor founding editor-at-large, and Tobin Marcus, Evercore ISI Senior U.S. Policy and Politics Strategist. Guys, thanks so much for joining us. Steve, I'll start with you here because we're talking about a long road for this whole situation, right? And still a long road to the next election. So how should voters, how should investment professionals, for that matter, be thinking about this indictment?
Well, the true answer is they shouldn't be listening to any of us. They should be reading the indictments themselves, look at the material, and watch the court process, the legal process in America play out. A lot of us are trying to game what might happen, how Donald Trump might respond. What's the red line for Republican voters who, as you just pointed out in one CBS News poll, Donald Trump looks unaffected. There's another CBS News poll that shows 75% of the likely GOP voters either feel like there's no impact on their decision or their favorability towards Trump actually increased. So as we're gaming all of this, which is largely a political question, as your previous guest just said, there's a legal process underway, and it's going to take some time. And there are other legal processes from Fulton County, Georgia, another decision from Jack Smith, likely with regard to Donald Trump's activities on January 6th. There's a lot of stuff coming out, and voters should go to the substance and make judgments from that.
Tobin, what about you? Does this move the needle at all for voters?
In the primary, I think the answer is no. I agree with Steve and with James that, if anything, we're seeing a rally around the flag effect. I think the fact that all of Trump's would-be challengers, with the lone exception of long shot candidate Asa Hutchinson, either totally accepted his kind of witch hunt frame on this and characterized it as weaponization of law enforcement, or, from the more Trump critical folks, couldn't bring themselves to go beyond just saying, let's wait for all the facts to come out. Let's allow some time. Let's unseal the indictment and get a look at the details. Really tells you everything that you need to know about the willingness of anyone in the party and the political attitude of anyone in the party to buck the kind of party line on this. In the general, it's a very different story. I don't think that the marginal Republican voter in the general election is going to be someone who is not, rock solid loyal to Trump or rock solid loyal to the Republican Party. And those folks at the margin, I think, are going to have valid concerns about this. The indictment looks quite grave. I can't imagine that the way that it plays out between now and then, not just this case, but, the other forthcoming indictments and the trial in the Manhattan case are, I think, going to alienate some moderates and swing voters who the Republicans might plausibly need to get over the finish line in the general.
Yeah, Tobin, this is something that our Rick Newman has maintained throughout this, that, there were definitely a cohort of sort of classic Republican voters who held their noses and voted for Trump because they wanted the sort of historical lower taxes that, are reputed, if not always enacted, by the Republican Party. And you do wonder, Steve, if that changes the calculus this time around.
Oh, you're saying, Steve? Well,
Sorry.
I think that what changes the calculus this time around are the number of, just the legal quagmire that Donald Trump is in. I think Tobin gets exactly right. He's got a path that remains very wide to the GOP nomination. But after right now, if we're held tomorrow, he would secure that GOP nomination. But when it comes to the general election, I think he has some real problems. And when you think you're asking about crossovers, I interviewed a bunch of billionaires once who were Democratic billionaires and Republican billionaires. This was during the Trump administration. I said, is Donald Trump friend or foe? And for all of them, they said friend. They said he has reduced taxes so substantially. He's made the American economy globally competitive again. And that made a real difference for them across the board. But when you have someone with the legal pileup that he has right now, it begins to raise the question, at least I would think among some Republicans, is does their franchise, rise or fall, and all of their prospects rise or fall based around this individual? And I think Tobin is right. Many of the weaker affiliated Republicans and certainly independents are in much more shaky territory when it comes to supporting a Donald Trump candidacy.
And yeah, just as we kind of think about how this has played out, even in some of the recent elections, whether that is the general election in 2020, whether that's the runoffs, whether that is the midterm elections, there hasn't been as much of a red wave riding on the back of an endorsement from Donald Trump for some of those candidates as was anticipated. And so in place of a wave and there instead being a ripple, how much does that begin to wane in terms of some of the effectiveness, even though we are taking a look at some of the polling numbers, which you can do what you will with polling at this point going into many of these elections? Steve? Yeah, Tobin, go ahead.
Oh, sure. I was going to say the results of the midterms, I think, are really instructive here. Democrats won independents by 2 points in the midterms, which is extraordinarily rare in a midterm election for the president's party during that president's first midterm to win independents. And I think that just goes to show how important persuasion still is in the modern electoral landscape. A lot of politics in recent years has been about base mobilization, and that game of kind of getting your base riled up and turning out your respective side is hugely important. But there are a lot of persuadable voters in the middle still, frankly, on whom the election will swing. I fully expect that both Biden and Trump would go into this election with high unfavorable numbers, and there will be a lot of voters who are looking at two candidates they don't like and having to choose among them. But there will be many of them who look at this legal morass and think that the reasons they dislike Trump are a lot more serious than the reasons they dislike Biden.
Tobin.
And what I would add to that,
ahead,
if I may, is that while Tobin is right that you're going to have with two flavors of ice cream, if you will, in the end. One of the things we saw in the midterm election was essentially, in my view, a real weakness of the Democratic Party, which was being dependent on the Roe v. Wade, on the Dobbs decision, on being dependent essentially on the January 6th narrative. Now, these are genuine issues. It's the solvency of American democracy and the solvency or not of women's rights in this country, as opposed to an agenda that is driving them forward. And I think one of the really interesting challenges out there between the parties, say what you will about Republicans, they have the Supreme Court. They've moved a 6-3 majority on that court. They've achieved a lot when it comes to abortion rights, and they're able to show that and basically say our franchise is delivering to you regardless of how crummy our leader might be. And so I think it's very important to remember that if you have a candidacy depending on the other side doing bad things versus what your focus is, that's also going to be part of the environment. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think it's often an overlooked part of the competition between both parties.
Well, I think that Democrats could reasonably argue that they have delivered on a lot of their agenda, with the exception of something like Roe v. Wade. They just haven't done a great job of the strategic messaging, of that part of it. Finally, Tobin, I just want to ask you, again, to bring it back to the markets, right, which is our bread and butter here, and investors, what they should be paying attention to here, or can they just not pay attention until we get a lot closer and further along in the presidential race before they can start to sort of game out what effect it could have on the markets?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a near-term set of questions around kind of acute turmoil in response to the legal milestones in these cases. I tend to think that the risk of that is relatively low. Certainly in the Manhattan case, there was some kind of sound and fury, and then ultimately we had more journalists than protesters at the arraignment. We'll see how tomorrow goes. The volume of that could increase, and that could be a concern for markets. But I will largely, I think we'll kind of wait to see that before getting concerned. Looking further down the road, I think there are differences between Trump and the rest of the Republican field on issues like China and issues like conceivably, interest in trying to repeal the drug price negotiation pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so anything that moves the primary one way or another, I think is relevant in those terms when you're looking at the long-term valuations for some companies that are exposed to his kind of policy idiosyncrasies on those dimensions. But for now, looks like he's quite firmly in control in the primary, probably more than ever. And then, looking at the general, there is a huge amount of fiscal policy depending on who wins next year, with Republicans proposing $3.5 trillion plus in tax cuts from extending the expiring pieces of the Trump tax cuts, Biden probably wanting to extend those below 400,000, let them expire above. And of course, a wide range of regulatory matters across the government, particularly in energy, but really across the board. So any of these things that, are shifting people's assessments of the general election landscape are, I think, hugely important when filtered through that lens.
All right. Well, we will continue to track to see what moves the needle for voters as well as for investors on that front. Tobin Marcus, Evercore ISI Senior U.S. Policy and Politics Strategist, and Steve Clemons, Semafor Founding Editor at Large. Gentlemen, thanks so much for taking the time this morning.
Thank you.